The colonel's laughter cut through the firing range like a blade, sharp, dismissive, and loud enough for every soldier nearby to turn. It was the kind of laugh that didn't come from humor, but from disbelief wrapped in arrogance. He stood with his arms crossed, a seasoned war veteran built like stone, staring down at the small girl who barely reached the height of the rifle racks. Dust swirled at her ankles as a hot desert wind passed, but she didn't flinch. Her hands were steady, her expression calm, too calm for a child, facing a man known for breaking egos with a single raised brow. She simply repeated what she had said moments earlier, her voice soft but unwavering. The request sounded impossible, even ridiculous to the men around her. They whispered, snickered, exchanged looks that suggested this was nothing more than a moment of amusement. A little girl, barely 10, asking to shoot where Navy SEALs trained their finest, it felt like a joke delivered with the straightest face. Yet there was something odd, an absence of fear in her eyes, something old, heavy, and quiet, like she had seen more than she should have. The colonel noticed it for the briefest of seconds, and then dismissed it. Children dream strange dreams, he told himself. This one just wandered too far, but the base wasn't a place where wandering children were common. Most civilians avoided it. The gates alone felt like the edge of a world that demanded steel nerves and bruised histories. And yet she stood there, small shoes planted firmly on concrete scorched by the sun, wearing a backpack too worn for its age and a determination too sharp for her size. The colonel signaled to the range master with a tilt of his head. If she wanted to embarrass herself, let her. Better to end the foolishness quickly. The men stepped aside, forming a loose circle, half amused, half pitying. They had seen elite candidates crumble under the pressure of these tests. They had watched grown men tremble while trying to prove they had what it took to become legends. And now they waited to see a child fail so spectacularly that the memory would fuel their jokes for months. But the girl moved with an unsettling stillness, almost as if she were shrinking the world around her until only she and the rifle existed. Her fingers brushed the weapon with familiarity, not curiosity. She didn't examine it like a new object. She handled it like an old friend. Some of the soldiers' smiles faltered. The colonel's amusement cooled. Her breathing deepened, shoulders relaxed not like a student ready to learn, but like a master returning home. For a moment, time thickened. The wind stilled. The soldiers leaned in unconsciously as she lifted the rifle with a precision none of them expected. How could hands that small know the perfect weight distribution? How could someone so young move with the unthinking confidence of someone who had survived fire instead of fearing it? The colonel's jaw tightened, his laughter fading completely. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. This was no coincidence, no childish bravado. This girl had walked into the heart of an elite military range with the kind of silence that made men uneasy. There were stories, whispered legends of children shaped by war, sharpened by circumstances darker than adults could imagine. But those were stories rumors told on long deployments, and yet here she was. When she set her stance, several SEAL instructors stiffened. That stance wasn't taught in basic programs. It belonged to a school few in the world had ever seen. The colonel suddenly understood that this moment wasn't a joke. It was the beginning of a revelation he wasn't prepared for. The first shot cracked through the range with a sharp, disciplined precision that didn't belong to childhood. It carried the weight of something practiced, repeated so many times, that the action was no longer a skill, but an instinct. The soldiers straightened instantly, their smirks evaporated, replaced by an alert silence more fitting for battlefield briefings than morning drills. Even the colonel, a man carved by years of commanding hardened operatives, felt something cold settle beneath his ribs. The bullet struck the distant target dead center. Not near, center, not impressively close. Perfect. The kind of perfect that didn't happen on accident, didn't happen with luck, didn't happen even with natural talent. unless that talent had been relentlessly sculpted. Before anyone could make sense of it, the girl fired again, another perfect hit, and again, and again. Her movements didn't change. She didn't look proud or excited, or even aware of the shock spreading behind her like a slow-moving wave. Her face stayed eerily composed, no trembling, no hesitation, no searching for approval. She behaved as if this precision was ordinary, expected, even necessary. The colonel's throat tightened. Memories he had spent years burying clawed their way back, memories of children in conflict zones, trained not by choice but by survival. He had seen that same terrifying calm on faces far too young to display it. Eyes that fired weapons with the emptiness of people who had watched the world burn around them and learned to survive its ashes. A fresh unease rippled through the instructors. They exchanged glances, uncertain whether to be impressed or alarmed. One SEAL, a man with years of sniper operations behind him, took a step closer. He had taught candidates who would go on to become some of the best marksmen alive, men whose skill was spoken of in the same breath as legends. Yet even he had never seen a child handle a rifle like it was a continuation of her own pulse. When she finally paused, she didn't lower the weapon fully. She simply adjusted her footing, more shots coming, more accuracy demanded by a silent, internal judge. The colonel exhaled for what felt like the first time in minutes. This wasn't skill alone. This was conditioning. But how? Who taught her? Where did she come from? Why did her eyes hold the quiet of someone who had buried more than memories? A whisper floated through the gathering crowd, a soldier murmuring a thought others were too afraid to voice. "That's impossible. Not even our top trainees hit that clean." The colonel turned sharply toward him, silencing the man with a single look. But inside, he agreed, he felt something else too, an uncomfortable prickle of guilt. He had laughed at her, mocked her, dismissed her entirely. Now every perfect hole in the target felt like an indictment of his arrogance. The girl continued firing, her rhythm steady, her breaths measured with mathematical discipline. Each pull of the trigger seemed choreographed with her heartbeat. It wasn't natural, it was trained, engineered. By the time her final shot echoed across the range, the target looked like a machine had carved precision holes through it. The instructors stared, trying to process what they were seeing. The colonel walked forward slowly, his boots crunching against scattered brass casings. He lifted the target sheet with a hand that felt suddenly too unsure. Every record the SEALs held, every high score, every legend whispered to new trainees, had just been broken by a girl who stood barely past childhood's edge. But what shook him more wasn't the achievement, it was the expression on her face. She looked neither triumphant nor proud. Instead, she appeared resigned, as though excellence was expected of her, required of her, as though each perfect shot was not victory, but obligation. Something was consuming her from within, something invisible, but heavy enough to bend her shoulders ever so slightly under its weight. The colonel swallowed hard. This wasn't a prodigy, this was a survivor. And whatever story had forged her into this, whatever past she carried in her silent gaze, it was walking toward him now, disguised as a child with a rifle. The colonel found himself studying her as she stood in the settling silence, the rifle now resting calmly at her side. The desert sun pressed down hard, yet she seemed untouched by its heat, as if she had learned long ago how to ignore discomfort the way others ignored background noise. He tried to reconcile the contradiction before him. A child's frame holding the bearing of someone who had lived through storms even soldiers struggled to endure. As he approached, he noticed something he had missed earlier. A faint tremor beneath her stillness, not of fear, but of endurance. A child should not have known how to mask exhaustion. A child should not have known how to hide pain so carefully that only someone trained to see broken things could catch it. But the colonel saw it, a quiet echo beneath the armor she had built around herself. The instructors watched with an uneasy anticipation. They weren't sure what the colonel would say, or whether he even had words that could match the enormity of what they had witnessed. No one on that range had ever seen a revelation so silently delivered, so brutally undeniable. Before he could speak, the girl lifted her eyes to him steady, unblinking, carrying an intensity that seemed too old for someone who still tied her shoes with double knots. He felt as if she were measuring him, weighing him with a clarity that most adults never achieved. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't defiance. It was a question, silent but heavy. "Do you see me now?" The colonel did, uncomfortably so. He realized she was waiting not for praise, not for validation, but for permission. The weight of that struck him harder than any battlefield memory. Children asked for many things, but permission to prove themselves beyond human limits was never one of them. Not unless their childhood had been stolen. Not unless they had been forced to grow sharp instead of soft. A gust of wind carried sand across the range, and for a moment he imagined her standing in a place far from here, some shattered corner of the world where survival depended on precision, silence, and an ability to disappear into darkness. A place where innocence was lost the moment danger learned a child's name. He cleared his throat, but before he could form a single sentence, a SEAL instructor stepped forward. His voice was low, uncertain. "Sir, this isn't normal. No kid shoots like that. Hell, no sniper shoots like that." The colonel didn't answer. He kept his gaze on the girl, sensing something deeper than extraordinary talent, something fractured, something that had cracked her childhood open and poured discipline into the spaces where laughter should have been. He wondered how long she had been carrying this burden of perfection, and who had demanded it from her. "What's your name?" he asked gently, but her lips barely parted before closing again. She hesitated not out of fear, but caution. As though names had been used against her before, as though identities were something traded carefully, like secrets or ammunition. She remained silent, and the colonel understood more from that silence than any words she could have spoken. Someone had taught her not to trust easily. Someone had trained her for reasons that had nothing to do with childhood curiosity. Someone had turned her into a weapon. His chest tightened at the thought. He had seen many things in his career: bravery, cruelty, sacrifice, but nothing shook him quite like the idea of a child, molded by war's merciless hand. Then, unexpectedly, she reached into her worn backpack. The soldiers tensed instinctively, but what she pulled out was not dangerous, at least not in the way they expected. It was a photograph, edges frayed, colors fading. She held it out, her hands steady. The colonel took it carefully. It showed a man in uniform, tired eyes, gentle smile, holding the same little girl who now stood in front of him. The insignia on the man's sleeve made the colonel's breath catch. He recognized it instantly, a covert SEAL unit that had gone dark years ago, lost during an operation that never made it into official records. Understanding dawned slowly, painfully. This wasn't a prodigy. This was a daughter searching for answers, a child shaped by the legacy of a father who had never come home. And she had come here, into the heart of the institution that had once shaped him, to prove something. To herself, to them, to the memory she carried like a hidden scar. The colonel felt the full weight of her presence settle on him. She hadn't come to impress them. She had come to confront a truth she had lived with for far too long. The colonel held the photograph as though it were something fragile, something alive. The worn image trembled slightly in his hand, not from the desert wind, but from the sudden heaviness pressing into him. The man in the picture wasn't a stranger. He had served beside him. They had shared missions, stories, silences, and the kind of trust that only forms when death walks beside you often enough to become familiar. And now his daughter stood before him, carrying the quiet imprint of everything her father had been, and everything he had endured. The truth settled in layers, each one heavier than the last. Her father hadn't vanished into myth or rumor. He had vanished into sacrifice. The colonel remembered the classified briefings, the hushed conversations, the restless nights when he questioned the cost of missions that never saw daylight. He remembered the moment he was told the team was gone. No survivors, no retrieval, just loss filed under sealed documents and silent grief. Looking at the girl now, he understood the ache behind her stoic calm, the discipline etched into her movements. The reason she sought out the SEAL range with such unwavering resolve, she wasn't searching for glory. She was searching for connection to the world her father had belonged to, the world that had taken him from her. Her eyes, the same quiet determination he had seen in her father, watched him carefully, as though she could sense the moment recognition struck him. A flicker of vulnerability crossed her expression, quick as a shadow. It was the first unmistakably childlike emotion she had revealed since stepping onto the range. It told him everything she had been too guarded to say. I need to know who he was. I need to know why. The colonel felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like armor. All the soldiers around them, hardened though they were, sensed the shift too. The range no longer felt like a training ground. It felt like a place where a long, buried truth was finally being unearthed. He knelt to her level not to diminish himself, but to meet her where she stood, carrying the ghost of a man he once admired. Her gaze didn't waver. She didn't step back. She didn't flinch. Instead, she held his stare with a quiet that cut deeper than any spoken plea. He would have been proud of you, the colonel whispered inwardly, though the words never crossed his lips. He wasn't sure if saying them aloud would ease her burden or shatter her entirely. What mattered was that he understood her now, not as a curiosity, not as a prodigy, but as a child standing bravely in the echoes of a legacy she had been forced to grow into. He offered the photograph back to her, but when she reached for it, he didn't immediately let go. Their hands met over the worn edges, and he felt the cold determination humming through her fingertips. The kind of determination that grows out of pain, the kind that asks not for pity, but for truth. You came here to prove something, he thought. But maybe you came here hoping we could give something back to you. He released the photo, and she tucked it carefully into her backpack, as though returning it to a sacred place. For the first time, her facade cracked just enough for exhaustion to seep through. It wasn't the exhaustion of effort. It was the exhaustion of carrying too much for too long alone. The colonel stood and glanced at the instructors. Their expressions were no longer skeptical or amused. They looked at her with a respect reserved for those who had bled in silence. She had broken every SEAL training record not because she sought fame, but because perfection had been her shield against grief. He turned back to her, sensing the crossroads she stood at. Her journey had brought her here, driven by a mix of longing and loss, but she couldn't walk the rest of it without guidance. Her eyes searched his face, and he felt the unspoken question lingering between them. Would they allow her into the world that had defined her father? Would they let her step into a path shadowed by danger and secrets? Or would they protect her from the very life that had shaped her resilience? The colonel breathed deeply. The decision wasn't simple, but the truth was clear. The child before him didn't need permission to be extraordinary. She already was. He lowered his voice, speaking with a gentleness only she could hear. Your father never broke. He thought silently, letting the truth settle in his chest. And neither will you. She didn't smile. But she lifted her chin, just slightly, and in that small motion he saw something shift within her, a quiet acceptance that she was no longer standing alone in the shadow of her father's legacy. She was standing in the beginning of her own. The soldiers around them watched as the colonel placed a hand over his heart, a gesture not of ceremony but of honor. Unspoken, heartfelt honor. The girl held his gaze, and for the first time since she walked onto the range, her eyes softened. A child had walked in seeking answers. A marksman had revealed herself. A legacy had been reborn. And the colonel knew, with a certainty that echoed through him like a vow, that her story was only just beginning.